Hello. So today in this video, I'm going to take you through the basics of how to write a good 15-mark answer. Remember, this is AO2, which is evaluation. I have done a video as well for writing a 10-marker, so check that out if you haven't already. Okay, let's get started. So here are just some basics that you need to know about how to write a 15-marker. So in the exam, you would have about 27 minutes. Again, like I said, for a 10 marker, it could be slightly more, it could be slightly less for some people. And if you have extra time, you need to figure out how much extra you're going to have and then how you're going to use that. 15 markers always look the same. It's always a statement followed by evaluate this claim. That's all you get. So as long as you know what that means, you shouldn't have any problem. You get less kind of variation with 15s than you do with 10s. So in some ways, once you've nailed a few, they become quite easy because it's the same skills that you're using every time. You always must include a conclusion in a 15 marker that makes it clear what your evaluation of the statement is. If you don't do that, then arguably you haven't really answered that question. So that's super crucial. It's not needed for a 10, but it definitely is for a 15. Okay. You must engage with both sides of the argument. As you'll see in a moment when we look at the levels of response, this is really important for getting into those higher levels. An answer that's very one-sided, that's only looked at one possible side of the argument, isn't going to be eligible for the higher levels. And speaking of the higher levels, you need to include some critical analysis in order to get into those higher levels. So this isn't just a case of saying, on the one hand, some people think this, but on the other hand, some people think that. That isn't critical analysis. That's just saying two different points of view. Critical analysis means engaging with those different points of view, pointing out the strengths and the weaknesses, pointing out bits that don't really work, pointing out bits that are especially convincing. And that is quite hard to do. And the best way to get good at that is just to keep doing it, just learn by doing. You won't always get it right, but the more you practice, the better you'll get. It's a bit like anything else, really. So let's have a look here. What I've got here are the top two bands of the levels of response. So we've got level 4 and level 5. So this is 10 out of 15 all the way up to 15 out of 15. This is where you want to be aiming. So you can see for the top band of marks, you've got to have a perceptive discussion of different views, including scholars, schools of thought with critical analysis. It's not always going to be scholars, but a lot of the time it will be. And if there's a particular scholar that's relevant to the argument you've been asked to have, they will expect to see some reference to their views in your answer. So I'll give you an example in a minute. There is an appropriate evaluation fully supported by the reasoning. This is your conclusion. If that's not there, I don't see how you can say you've answered the question. And the other thing, precise use of the appropriate subject vocabulary. So if you're using technical terms that are unique to RS, you've got to be using them in the right way. Level 4, you can see, is similar, but just not quite as good. Below level 4, we're starting to drop off into marks that are not really going to get you very high grades. So we want to be aiming for this level 4 and 5 if we possibly can. Right, a couple of really important things for you. Firstly, do not treat this as a 10 marker. Don't write down everything you know about the topic. You'll get really low marks if you do that. I've seen it loads. People are really tempted to just kind of, you know, if it's a question on the design argument, they'll write an opening paragraph saying what the design argument is. Resist that temptation. You don't need to do it. That's not what you're being asked. Equally, and I've checked this out with the exam board, an introduction is not needed. There's no extra marks for doing an introduction. Some people do like to do them because it helps them get into their argument. I don't have a problem with that. I tend not to do them myself, but if you do one, make sure it's saying something useful, make sure it's contributing to the question. Because if you just do an introduction that says the question again, but in more words, there's no marks for that. So there's no point doing it. Like I've said before, I'm going to bang on about this all the way through. A conclusion is definitely needed. It's non-negotiable. If you don't include a conclusion, straight away, I think you're limiting yourself to about 7 out of 15, which is not very helpful. And again, don't go mad with the knowledge, because your knowledge will come across if you evaluate well enough, if you have the argument. The examiner is looking at how well you evaluate the statement. They're not looking at how much can you remember about the design argument or natural moral law or whatever it is. So be careful there. Okay, so what I've done here is I've shown you how I plan these. And if you're taught by me, you'll have seen me do this in class as well. So I think the best way to do it is just a dead simple table, and your headings for the table are, what are your two sides of the argument? So in this example, which is about Paley's design argument, you're being asked to evaluate Paley's design argument fails to prove the existence of God. So the two sides of the argument there are obvious. It's yes, it does fail. No, it doesn't fail. It succeeds. So once you've established that, you can put those as your two little headings and then just spend about a minute sketching out a couple of points on each side. I've done 3 on each side here, but you might not actually need that many. The point of a plan is just so that you know where you're going, so that you're not tempted to veer off and start writing about stuff you're not going to get any marks for. So it's really, really worth doing this. Particularly, I would say, if you're someone who has extra time, this is a great way to use some of that extra time, because it can then keep your thoughts on track as you're writing. So how to turn the plan into an essay? There are a few different ways. Some people like to do alternate points, so almost like a game of tennis, kind of going back and forth between fails and succeeds, or yes and no, or whatever the two sides of the argument are. That can work. It can also work doing all of your first column in one big paragraph followed by your second column in another big paragraph. That can work as well. You're going to have to try both and see what suits you best. Again, the exam board don't mind. They don't have a preference as to how you structure it, as long as you're answering the question. And then in terms of how much to write, when I do these, they normally end up being about 2.5 sides of A4, but it's going to vary if you're handwriting or if you're typing. And again, this is not something that I want you to worry about very much. I'm more concerned that you make good use of the 27 minutes than that you produce a set amount of writing. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time on conclusions now, because this is one of the most important things. This here is a bad conclusion, but this is something that we see quite a lot, particularly when people are just still learning. This is a bit too GCSE, but it's got other problems as well. So overall, I think Paley's argument doesn't prove the existence of God because it's a weak argument. Well, yeah, but you have to say why. You can't just do that. I'm an atheist, so no argument would ever convince me that God exists. Therefore, I agree with Hume. The examiner doesn't care. The examiner does not care that you are an atheist. You might be, but that's not relevant. You're not being asked what your opinion is. You're being asked, how convincing do you find each side of the argument? That's not the same thing. So it's okay to have views and to use those views to help you build your argument. But if you just bung an opinion in there, particularly one with no support, that's not going to cut it. That's not going to work. So hopefully you can see why that one isn't great. What I've done here is I've tried to do a much better one. So you can see this one is longer. I'm using technical terms correctly, like inductive arguments. And if you just read it through for a minute, hopefully what you'll notice is that I'm being a little bit subtle. It doesn't have to be just a straight yes, it fails, or no, it doesn't fail argument. So what I've argued here is that it might fail to prove the existence of God, but that's not the same as saying it's a terrible argument. That's not the same as saying it has no value. So you can do that. Your conclusion doesn't have to be black and white, yes or no. If there's a middle, then, and you feel that that is genuinely where you are, you can go for that. What's not a good idea though is just to say, this is very difficult, I don't know, because again, that's not really saying anything. It looks like you're just dodging the question. So just briefly, here's a couple more examples of what else a 15 marker might look like. Sometimes, particularly for Christianity, they have set ones like this first one. There is little agreement within Christianity about the nature of God. And with this, it can be harder to spot what the two sides are. But actually, all it is that statement true? Is there a little bit of agreement, or is there a lot of agreement? Are Christians generally on the same page about God, or are Christians completely split on the idea of God? Once you've got your two sides of the argument, then you can plan, and then it should get easier. And then an ethics one as well. It is impossible to make good moral decisions using situation ethics. I would say your key word there is impossible, because somebody might say, well, you're not consulting rules, you're doing it all off your own back, it's too much responsibility, so it's impossible to know if you've got it right. But on the other hand, what's good about situation ethics? What makes it perfectly possible to make good moral decisions? It's all about giving yourself a minute to think, what are my two sides? Where am I going to go first? And then once you're working through that, working out where am I going to end up? So we're nearly done. Just finally, a couple of tips for you. It's okay to say, I think, I find this convincing, my view is. It's okay to say that. I know some subjects don't like you to do that. I've checked with AQA, they don't mind. But the key thing there is, remember, the examiner does not care about your opinion. They're only interested in the quality of your arguments. So you can use phrases like that to help you evaluate, but ultimately it's not about what you think, it's about how well are you evaluating. Remember, you've got to both sides it. Don't just stick with the side you agree with and miss out the other side of the argument. Even if the other side of the argument is one that you really don't agree with, it's still got to be in your essay and it's still got to be critiqued. Okay? Like I said before, don't start with an explanatory paragraph. It's not needed. It's just going to waste your time. I'm a big fan of planning. I really recommend planning, even if it's super brief, even if it's just a few words to keep you on track. That can be the difference between a great essay and a dodgy essay. Conclusion's crucial. I'm never going to stop saying that, but it doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be just a straight yes or no. You can take a more nuanced approach if that's what you want to do. You can say it's true up to a point, it's partly true, it's true to some extent, some variation on that. What's important is that you say why. Okay? That's it. We're done with that. If you need any more help, please talk to one of your RS teachers. But again, like I said, what I would really recommend is just that you have a go at some of these, get a feel for them, and then after a while, you should find they become easier. Okay, thanks for listening. Take it easy.